this is military threats to Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, South China Sea, and so forth. And the people who were the architects of the policy, it had never occurred to anybody, except a very wise Polish diplomat, and a lot of Russians, that the Soviet Union might collapse. It was thought that it was absolute permanent, that the history had turned a page. This was a new kind of country. So a lot of the problems we have now with security are a result of the fact that China is now on her own without a counterbalancing power.
Moving on, how did the market crash of 2008 affect trade between the two countries?
Well, Chinese exports were greatly reduced because demand in the West for Chinese exports began to dry up, and many, many factories, particularly in southeast China, made all kinds of consumer goods. When I was your age, everything said "Made in USA" on it. Now everything says "Made in China." People say that doesn't make any difference. Well, actually, it makes a huge difference. But the Chinese economy itself is very much insulated from international pressure because the Chinese currency is not convertible into other currencies. Interest rates in China are not set by market forces. They are set by the government, and the turnover of financial instruments, say bonds, so forth and so on, is very, very low. There is in the Chinese stock market no market for control. You can't go out and buy a company by buying all its stock. The reason for that is that only 20 to 30% of the stock is what they call the float, is actually available. The government owns the rest. So nothing that happens outside really affects the stability of the economy for the time being. But maintaining that kind of stability exacts a big long-term price, because it's as if you had a sports car that had it had sort of no transmission. I mean, it would look great, all the rest, but it wouldn't really be able to go. Wouldn't be able to go fast. And the Chinese economy is developing in very distorted ways as a result of this caution.
So, how will the U.S. and China's economic relationship change as we go into the future?
Well, I think the biggest problem we have as a result of trade with China and general economic activities. Sorry, I'm going to have to use this again. The biggest problem we have is that we're destroying jobs in the United States. I mean, the unemployment rate is high. The government policy against unemployment is to make money cheap. In the old days, when the American economy was self-contained, cheap money meant that people thought it meant that people would then buy things, and then factories would have to open up to start manufacturing things. In fact, what happens is it just stimulates demands for imports. Now, a Chinese factory is a very different thing than an American factory. If we decided that we wanted to open one in Philadelphia, a factory that was run according to Chinese principles, with no unions allowed, very low wages, long working hours, poor working conditions, doors often locked, workers under discipline, and so forth. I mean, if you have Apple Computer or something, you've probably read about the actual conditions under which these things are made. So if we built an Apple Computer factory in Philadelphia that was like the Apple Computer factory in China, it would immediately be shut down as being in violation of every conceivable American law. But Apple can build one in China. And then the trick is, of course, that they can export the products of that factory to the United States and sell them as if they had been manufactured here. So the American workers don't have a chance against this. And I frankly don't know, I don't know where the jobs are going to come from in the next generation.
So I guess that just brings us into another question, is how human rights and environmental protection laws impact the trade relationship in the future?
Well, China is catastrophically polluted. The air is unbreathable. The latest estimates are that lifespan in Peking is 15 years less than it would be without pollution. The number of prisoners in China, I don't know, but I mean millions of people are under supervision. China is a complete police state. Now, during the Cold War, our position was that we were against police states, we were against secret police and sort of gulag-type labor and forced labor and all the rest in the Soviet Union. But when it came to China, we simply waived and suspended all of those requirements. And because we wanted to become closer to them economically, we encouraged American business to invest. So the latest figure, I mean, $100 billion at least in American manufacturing capability has been shifted to China because American companies have made the decision that it is cheaper and easier, and furthermore, there's no law against it to manufacture in China. I mean, if you have a factory in China and somebody starts talking about having a union, the police will just haul that person out and you'll never see them again. But that doesn't seem to bother us. I think at some point as a country we're going to have to decide where we stand on these issues. But for the moment there is so much money, so many people are becoming wealthy, legally and illegally, through China, not least the leadership of China itself, the Chinese National People's Congress, the sort of rubber stamp equivalent of our Congress, they have, the members of that have net assets of $90 billion. $90 billion, which is hundreds of times the net assets of our Congress. So we're dealing with a system which is environmentally irresponsible, which violates human rights, which is furthermore corrupt in the sense that the government steals money and privatizes it and sends it to Geneva and sends their children to Harvard. Yet which we feel can somehow be exempted from what we used to hold up as our national ideals. Why this is, why China gets this exception, I don't know. But it's in there from the very beginning, and it shows no sign of changing. So I suspect there's a rocky road ahead, particularly because China, a country which is a single-party dictatorship like China, is subject to no laws and is therefore subject to unforeseen changes. But I don't know. I mean, right now, if you go to Hong Kong, when I first went to Hong Kong in the 1960s, at the border there was no border crossing. There were just rice paddies as far as the hills before Canton. Now there's a superhighway, and you have 4 or 5 huge container trucks crossing every minute, and the trade is absolutely immense. And what's happening, as has always happened with China trade, is that goods are flowing from China to the United States, and money is flowing from the United States to China. Back when money was made out of things like gold and silver, it was possible to run out of it. So that was a crisis. Now that we can print money, it's not a crisis until they stop taking it. So that's, of course, at some point, some point they will stop, or somebody's going to stop taking it. But that will be something I hope that I hope that my generation doesn't have to deal with that. But your generation is going to have to deal with massive financial readjustments. Is that okay?
I just had to start over again.
Alright, so leading into our last question, which you kind of answered, but what does the U.S. need to do in order to improve most of their relation with China in the future?
Well, the relationship with China is difficult now for two reasons. One is economic and the other is political military. If we want to be a country which has employment, a high standard of living, is able to grow in such a way that we can pay off these massive debts that I mentioned. I mean, they're absolutely massive. These are debts. We're in the same situation as the Greeks. The only difference is the Greeks can't print money. We have to completely revamp our economic system so as to encourage investment, encourage market activity, encourage entrepreneurship, lower taxes, perhaps do what, say, Estonia has, have a flat tax. I mean, there are a whole series of things where it's like the Philadelphia subway. I mean, it's a 19th century relic of a time when Philadelphia was a leading city and very few cities had subways. But if you want to see a good subway today, I mean, you go to Tokyo, or you go to Singapore, or you go to Taipei, or you go to Shanghai or somewhere like that. Our fiscal and legal system is basically 19th century Civil War vintage, and it's completely non-competitive in today's world, either with China or with the newly independent countries of Europe. That's the economic side. So I'm quite serious. We're basically to be sucked dry, and you folks aren't going to have any jobs. Just go to a place like Syracuse, New York sometime and have a look around. And this used to be a prosperous, middle-sized manufacturing city. Now all they've got in Syracuse is a university, paid for with state taxes, and a lot of empty plazas with newspapers or whatever we use now instead of newspaper blowing around. I mean, it's just, there are no jobs there, period. So I think that's a crisis. From a military point of view and a political point of view, China now sees herself as a kind of dominant power in Asia. So she is exercising pressure against, most recently against South Korea and Japan. She's just announced fishing restrictions to her south, which will affect Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. She's built up a very, very large military, and it's just not clear what she's going to do with it. I think we have to face this situation, and we have to work with our allies in the region to be sure that we and our allies are so strong militarily that no one will dare to attack us. Because that's the way you keep peace. I mean, if you're going to walk around in a bad neighborhood after dark, what do you want to look like? You want to look like the toughest guy in the neighborhood. Then no one will attack you. Now, you may be as gentle as can be, but you want to look tough. And we don't want to tempt anybody by looking weak. And right now, of course, our military is being slashed. And China's military is growing about 10% a year. This can't go on indefinitely. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was pretty painless. I'm sorry to have sort of switched signals, but we had a thing with my son who's at college this morning that looked like we might have to drive up, and we wouldn't have been here this afternoon. And you're now going to a competition of some sort?
It's a documentary.
Documentary.
It's all submitted online.
All submitted online, I see.
It's a thing C-SPAN does every year.
Yep.
This year's message to Congress. What should the